You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Today, we explore the relationship between faith and science. And it's Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Tom Storck, not to be confused with our welcome guest, Thomas Sheahen. Professor Sheahen holds a PhD degree, that's the second degree, not the third degree, a PhD degree in physics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. During his 45-year career, some of us have only had 40-year careers, but during his 45-year career as a research physicist, he worked for, among others, Bell Telephone Laboratories, the National Bureau of Standards, and the United States Department of Energy. He was chosen as a Congressional Research Fellow by the American Physical Society, dealing with energy-related national legislation. A lifelong Catholic, Professor Sheahen is Director Emeritus of the Institute for the Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. He is the author of Everywhen, coming to us from En route Books and Media in 2021. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Professor Sheahen, Tom, if we may.
Yes.
What led you to write Everywhen?
Well, it was a series of things over a fairly long period of time. I'd been interested in the relationship between faith and science for half a century. And during that time, I became acquainted with Father Brungs at iTest and wrote some essays on various faith science topics. Time passed, and about the year 2000, I began to think about the idea of putting together a book. More time passed, and I was busy with a lot of things. I was still employed, a whole bunch of things like that. Eventually, my very capable daughter, excellent editor, Laura Sheahen, who, of course, has access to all my files, took these essays and assembled them into book form, in which she eliminated a lot of redundancy and all this sort of thing. And she then gave that to me, and all I had to do was patch things together and make it flow right and fix it up. But that took me about a year. Nonetheless, we finally got the book out at the very end of 2021, but not without a lot of reviews. there were many good readers who pointed out things that just weren't true or just weren't correct or weren't said right. And in particular, Father Bob Spitzer, who is probably the Catholic Church's leading theologian of science and faith, read my manuscript twice because he didn't like certain things the first time through. And I spent a fair amount of time correcting the representations I had made about the relationship between space and time in order to pass Father Spitzer's inspection and approval. So the effort really spanned a half a century, but the intense period of time was when my daughter got to work on the book and got to work on all those essays and turned it into a real book. And so if it had been left to me, I probably wouldn't have gotten it done until very, very old age. And so I'm very grateful to her for doing that. I'm grateful for all the readers, especially Father Spitzer, who went over it with a fine-tooth comb. And I think that the result is something that's of value to a lot of people.
Thanks for the background. Let me share with you, it'll become obvious as we go along, that we here on the Open Door need somebody to go through our work with a fine-tooth comb. Although in the case of those present, with the exception of Mario Ramos-Reyes, there's not a lot of hair to comb through. Now, I want to ask you one more background question, and then I'm going to turn things over momentarily to our man in Kansas, Mario Ramos-Reyes. But the other lead-in question I wanted to ask you is to tell us a little bit about the Institute for the Theological Encounter of Science and Technology. What do you folks do?
Well, first of all, we go by the name of iTest. Just like NASA, nobody can pronounce our full name. You did a very fine job in saying Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. We're a collection of people, some theologians, some scientists, physicists, chemists, etc., but a lot of other interested people too. We are predominantly Catholic, but not exclusively so. We consider ourselves interdisciplinary, interdenominational, and international. And this outfit, iTest, was founded by Father Bob Brungs in 1968, just a short time behind Vatican II. And he recognized in Gaudium et Spes the importance of relating and unifying faith with science. That's part of recognizing the importance of the modern world. So over the years, we've had people who are lawyers, doctors, accountants, all kinds of different professions represented. And the common thread of us all is the belief, the commitment that faith and science really are unified, really are partners, and can help each other learn. And so we've been rewarded with a lot of compliments from many sources, notably clergymen such as the late, great Father Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, who for some years was our ecclesial advisor. Father Brungs himself died in 2006, and I became the director soon thereafter. And Cardinal George, as our ecclesial advisor, kept us on the right path to make sure that we who were scientists still stayed in close contact with the church and enjoyed that unity of faith and science. So we've been around for more than half a century, and we expect to continue for quite a bit longer.
That's terrific, and to have Cardinal George as an advisor, that's really splendid. Now, there's a working stiff here today, and his work is with a group of people that are oftentimes referred to as nuns, with no U. nuns. And Mario Ramos-Reyes, I think, has to deal with those who think that there is a conflict between faith and science, although they might know very little about either. So, Mario, could you take us forward, please?
Well, it's very interesting, this effort, the Institute of Science and Technology, the Encounter Science Technology. But one of the things that people say very often is that there is no relationship, or there is contradiction between faith and science. That's one thing. Another thing that happened to me many years ago when I came to this country is the meaning of science. I was educated in a different meaning of science, which was broad, which include what we may call the Aristotelian science and domestic science. But when I got to this country, science has a very specific, not only denotation, but connotation. Would you mind clarifying for our viewers these issues, the apparent conflict between science and faith, and also what is the meaning of science in that context?
Well, the apparent conflict, I think, is heavily due to media and the need to have flamboyant headlines and sound bites and things like that. When you look carefully at science over the centuries, there has been a very long period of time, much of it led by the church, that in which science and philosophy and theology were all grouped together and were compatible. But probably the Enlightenment of the 18th century was the time when people antagonistic to religion wrote books and were heard and were scholars around mostly Europe. And over the subsequent century or two, there got to be this point of view that science was the thing that was going to tell us everything that was true, and that religion was a leftover from the distant past. And that view was not held by a whole lot of people, but it was broadcast and got into the universities and was otherwise ballooned up. So a lot of professors of whatever, history, English, etc., would make statements of the form that science says, ... because they'd heard about science from somebody else, but they were in fact not scientists at all. So this got to be the popular mantra that science disproves religion or science opposes religion, etc., etc. And the voice of those who found compatibility between science and religion was really kind of swept under the rug. We of iTest are trying to get it out in the open once again and keep insisting that science is the partner of religion, and we give examples of it and so forth. And we think there's been a turning of the tide lately, but it is absolutely true for a couple of centuries since the Enlightenment that the general view has been that science opposes religion. And this has put a lot of religious people into a defensive stance where they say, oh, I'm afraid of science. I don't want to go near science. And that's a mistake too. So we think that we're on the right track now in insisting that science is a partner of faith and that people need to pay attention to both and not just go around quoting some other guy out of the blue because he said something about science and religion, but rather to actually pay attention and study science and religion and see the relationship between them.
If I might jump in here and following up on Mario's question, as Tom just hinted, philosophy and theology were the paradigms of science for centuries. But in the Anglosphere, the Anglo-Saxon world, science has taken on a restricted meaning. So philosophy and theology are hardly seen as science anymore. They're considered at best to be means of exercising your mind or something like that, and not really at arriving at certain truth. And in fact, this is one question I have for Thomas Sheahen. As you know, for centuries, the kinds of questions you deal with in your book, Everywhen, were considered to be the province of philosophy and theology. And since the experimental sciences, what we call science in simpliciter in the US, since they deal only with phenomena, and as you point out in your book numerous times, their findings are always provisional. I'm not entirely sure what kind of a role they play in these essentially philosophical inquiries, where you have philosophical problems that really can't be treated simply on the basis of phenomena. Do you have any comments on that, or if I'm not clear, I'll explain more.
Well, I certainly agree with what you're saying about the history of the relationship between them, the sciences and theology. I came in through the door of science professionally. I'm a physicist, and my knowledge of theology is relatively scant, very scant compared to any theologian. So in writing the book Everywhen, I tried to put down the things I know about coming from a scientific direction. And the thing that impresses me so much about God's creation is the magnificence and the beauty of the laws of nature. The symmetry that is there, the symmetry principles that guide these laws. I come in that door and I bring with me that point of view, and I share that point of view with the readers. And what it leads me to see is that God has been an incredibly elegant and brilliant creator with an intelligence, a planning, and so forth, far beyond anything we can do. And when I say such things in the book, I'm hoping that people who are good theologians will see the reflection of God's capabilities in his creation, and then take the ball and run with it and extend much farther beyond what I have written into the realm of theology. So, as I say, I came in through the door of science, and that's where I bring my perspective, and I hope that people find value in it.
May I add something? No.
Of course.
You keep saying through the door of science. When I hear that, in my mind is empirical science. And so there are other sciences. And so the Western tradition was formed not only with a different rationality than the empirical science uses, but also a different view of science itself. So when I hear people, well, that's science, and always ask myself, what type of science are you talking about? Because if I do philosophy, I do science as well. If some people do theology, that's science as well. Now, of course, we need to explain what do we mean by that? What do we mean by sapiential rationality and all that? In other words, I'm not sure it's because the media is an echo chamber of people who are claiming that there is only one type of science, which perhaps we owe this to Augusto Comte, all these people. Because if you read Sam Harris, you read Daniel Dennett, they have this view of science, which is quite empirical, and the other are just not only outside the realm of science, that irrational. And so my point is that sometimes, at least that's perhaps my bias, we need to clarify from the get-go, what do we mean by science? What do we mean by rationality? So that we can engage in a dialogue with people who are claiming this contradiction. I don't know if I make more confusing statement, but.
Sure. The scientific method probably began about 800 years ago, and it was well developed, especially by Galileo, but then further by many other people over the centuries. The idea is that data, measurements, experiment is what you can depend upon. That's the reliable part. If you come up with a theory, it has to match the data, whether it be observations or experimental data. And any theory that fails to match the data is set aside, dismissed, out the window, etc. And that's the core of the scientific method. You always refer back to something concrete, something a port of a place, a reliable place, which is in the data. And so data trumps theory. Data is superior to theory. That's what it means to be doing science. And a theoretical scientist who is imagining things like a law of physics or a law of chemistry or whatever, a symmetry principle, all those nice things, always has to come back to the data as the reference. So that's what we mean contemporarily, in modern terminology, by the scientific method. And if you're anywhere else in literature, history, any of these things, you have useful ways of studying it and principles that you follow, etc. But in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, ultimately what you refer, your reference, your arbiter, your referee is the data. So that's what I think of as scientific method, and I think most of my colleagues in the sciences would agree with that characterization.
Well, I think that Mario's point, if you don't mind if I try to follow up on this, was that a fruitful discussion would be just, I mean, if it is true that, I mean, it is true, obviously, that philosophy and theology were considered sciences, in fact, a paradigm of sciences, theology, the queen of science. So if a limited set of experimental techniques have taken the name of science and banished philosophy and theology to the outer darkness, what does that mean? I mean, the Catholic Church, of course, has always had huge respect for human reason. And yet nowadays, human reason is too often limited to simply experimental sciences. And if people say, well, do you respect reason? They really mean, do you respect experimental science? Now, I'm not saying anything against experimental science. I'm simply saying, if I may be so bold, it should stay in its place and not try to take the place of philosophy or theology. And for example, with the question of time, Aquinas is quite clear that God is outside of time. That time, I mean, Aristotle actually, time is the measure of the motion of which is necessarily finite things. And so only when creation began can you say time began, because there was no motion before that. And all the philosophers and theologians who followed in the Thomistic tradition, and as you point out, Augustine, who was before Thomas, of course, all recognized that God was outside time. So I don't think we needed, for example, as you suggest in your book, I don't think we needed Einstein and the theory of relativity to realize that God is outside time. That was always known to philosophers and theologians, simply based on Aristotle's analysis of what time is.
Well, indeed, Thomas Aquinas's work is very, very sound and has been the guiding principles of theology for several hundred years. There is a big block of people in the world who have never caught on to God being outside of time. They, as humans, can only think in terms within time, and so they inadvertently assume that God is similarly constrained. And a point I make with great emphasis in the book is that that's a mistake, because if you think that God is bound by time, then you have essentially put a false God, time, ahead of God. And I want people to recognize that the reason they make that mistake is because their human limitations prevent them from thinking outside of time. None of us can do that. We're all stuck with time as part of our basic life. And the trying to acknowledge in God's superiority that he is outside of time is very, very difficult, because as soon as a person tries to express that thought in words, they trip over all kinds of analogies that are characteristic of human limitations. So in the book, I really say, hey, fellows, including fellow scientists, watch out, because you may have made a mistake in what you think about God, where you let one of your human limitations creep in. So the competent theologians who are talking in terms of St. Thomas and say God is outside of time are, of course, correct. But the people in everyday life never quite catch on to that.
Let me shift our focus a bit here. It's sometimes said that the world will be saved by beauty. And it might just be that the dialogue among scientists of an empirical sort and philosophers and theologians and the extraordinary, ordinary mortal, that discussion would be advanced by a reflection on beauty. Perhaps you could say a bit about how beauty is a major consideration in your own understanding of physics that in many respects is expressed using mathematics.
Sure. Probably the leading proponent of beauty as a guidepost to God is Bishop Bob Barron with his Word on Fire Institute. He's lectured very oftentimes on the importance of seeing beauty in things and finding your way to God via beauty. The way a scientist does that is by the beauty of the equations. Einstein once said, I tried to ask simple questions, and when the answers come back simple, that's when you hear God thinking. When we look at a theory, it has to have certain characteristics of symmetry, or else it's discarded. That's an important aspect of science, especially in physics. These symmetry principles are a form of beauty, a beauty in the equations, a way of, I guess, hearing God thinking. It's a guidepost. If you come up with a theory that violates certain symmetry principles, they toss it out at once. You can say assorted things about this or that phenomenon, but sooner or later, if you're going to have a comprehensive theory that applies to a whole lot of things, you fall back upon what scientists consider very, very beautiful, and that is symmetry. And so the symmetry in the equations may be meaningless, pardon me, may be meaningless to a ordinary citizen, but to a scientist, that's a very important form of beauty that is easily recognized within science, but oftentimes hard to recognize for a person in a different field.
But is it really?
Tom, just to follow up on that, and then we'll shift back to Tom Storck. When you speak of symmetry, you are speaking of symmetry as expressed and is found in mathematical formulations. Now, what about the claim that's oftentimes made by Thomists that mathematics doesn't mix so well as we might suppose with metaphysics, if only because in mathematics we're dealing with mental entities, we're dealing with abstractions, and strictly speaking, in mathematics, nothing happens. Whereas in metaphysics, in its attempt to grasp reality, is attempting to grasp a reality in which all sorts of things are happening all the time. There's a certain necessary static dimension of mathematics, which is not present at all in a world which ultimately reflects transition one after another, after another, after another, from potency to act. And because of this fundamental ontological gap between mathematics and reality, reflection on beauty in mathematical formulations doesn't really connect with beauty in the natural world.
Yeah, what you say is highly true. There is a disconnect there, and there's a gap, a gulf, in fact, between those who find mathematics helpful and those who find it an obstacle. Again, iTest tries to bring these two disparate points of view together and show that there's a relationship between science on the one hand and theology on the other. It's where the word encounter is in our title. The times when I've been in discussions with people and fallen into a mathematical way of thinking, I find that those I'm discussing it with don't really comprehend what I'm trying to say. In my book, I worked very hard to try to get some of these ideas across in a way that was talking about the mathematics of science, theoretical physics, if you like, and explain how that really does relate to our real world. And I may not have done a very good job of it because it's hard to relate mathematics to the everyday world that people know of. So the problem of communicating between these two aspects of culture is a very difficult one. And I think those of us in science have to really make an extra effort to try to be relatable. And at the same time, theologians, I think, would find value in appreciating the kind of beauty that scientists find in symmetry principles, in the laws of nature. So there's an opportunity to come together, but we sure haven't gotten there yet.
Lots of work to be done, and when possible, it should be shared work, right? So now,
absolutely,
back to Thomas Storck, and then Mario is just waiting to get into this. So,
okay.
Well, Jim, you kind of asked the question that I was going to ask, no doubt better than I would have put it, but I'll ask another question instead. If it's correct, and I think it is, that the world of mathematics is essentially a mental world, an abstraction from the real world, to be sure, but in a mental constructs. Is it legitimate to go from a mental construct to claiming that thus and such must exist or does exist in the real world, when my chief evidence for it would seem, when one's chief evidence for it would seem to be, gee, the equation is beautiful. There's symmetry here. And I don't think it's just a matter of the fact that many people don't understand higher mathematics. That's certainly true and deplorable, I admit. But it's a sense that, well, maybe mathematics here is trying to do something that is not mathematical, as Jim suggested, is really a metaphysical question, not a mathematical question. And by engaging in this type of discourse, are we Catholics kind of selling out the fort in the sense of, well, philosophy and theology, we're not going to insist people really get into that anymore. We'll accept the modern world, or at least the modern Anglo-Saxon world's evaluation of them, and we'll just deal with what you call the hard sciences.
Yeah, well, again, I agree with you that this disparity in cultures is an important thing to deal with. I don't have all the answers there. To communicate properly with others and to share the perception of beauty that each of us has coming from different fields is oftentimes difficult, but it's a absolutely worthy enterprise to try to express that beauty to one another. So it's a work in progress, to say the least. Mario, you were going to jump in with something.
Mario. Oh, look at, he's running out of the room. Stop, Mario, stop.
You said, well, we talk about beauty, Bishop Barron. But the claim that he's making, I think, is appropriate. You can trace back to Aquinas. And Aquinas has a very unique view of rationality, of science. And so ultimately, if I could make this claim, about, let's say, God or the Creator through beauty or his beauty is a metaphysical claim. So we need metaphysics. Now, how in the world we are going to need metaphysics? How then we are going to find metaphysics in a world which from the get-go, we already get one notion of science? There is one book I think is very interesting, even if I think it's not, it's very polemical, but I think is very good in understanding, is the Edward Fesser book, The Last Superstition. We have certain belief today about many things, and we have forgotten a long tradition. And many of these issues that people claim to know today were thought long time ago. And sometimes we have a notion, let's say, I'm going to go again, science, which we owe probably to Auguste Comte, basically, and his reading of history in 3 stages and all that. But ultimately, if we don't trace back to the beginning and understand the whole picture, then we may use certain terminology that fall into the hand of those who reduce science to one aspect of reality. And I think that is very, for me at least, very difficult. Because one of the questions that I think G wrote was precisely how then we go about and teach Stephen Hawking's the biblical notion of God, if we may not even know what metaphysics is all about.
I have to say you're absolutely right. If we don't know these metaphysical concepts, then all the science in the world won't do us much good. And conversely, if we don't know science, being a star in metaphysics doesn't get you there either. So that's why I think the partnership between science and theology is so important, and to getting anywhere, to knowing, to marching down the pathway towards God.
Is it really true?
Both.
Is it really the case, Tom, that if you don't know science, metaphysics won't get you anywhere? I certainly agree that there will be gaps there that you would have, and potential problems. But I would suggest that you'd be able to get an overall picture of the situation via metaphysics, even if your science was limited to that of the 13th century. So I'm not sure that I would agree with what you said when you said that.
Well, you got me there, and I don't necessarily agree with what I just said either, which is to say it don't get you anywhere is not the correct wording by any means. It is absolutely true that a very large fraction of the human race has done perfectly well in their relationship with God without having the faintest idea about any of these laws of physics or beauty and symmetry principles or any of that. So people do get along quite well in the absence of science, but it's better if you do bring science and theology together, because then you rise above these apparent conflicts which have been advertised so heavily over the last couple of centuries. So I look at people like Father Spitzer, who's very capable in science and very skilled in theology, and I think he's got his act together. He's got the right answer. He knows what he's talking about. And the unity of science and faith is what really is most valuable of all.
I wonder whether the supposed attack of science on religion is mostly the result of our Protestant culture, which insisted, for example, on a literal 7-day creation and other sorts of things, and refused to read the Old Testament according to the various literary genres that it comprises. So I wonder whether it's that conflict, which admittedly is real in many people's mind, although it's really hocus. I mean, it's really not there at all. But it does exist, yes, and including in these new atheists who exploit it. But I wonder whether or not they're just reacting to the contours of a Protestant biblicist culture that never understood theology in the first place, and hence one doesn't know how to deal with this. But that a Catholic and then someone in the Catholic culture is going to say science, theology, conflict. How could that possibly be?
You've got a very good point there. The 6 Day Creationists really got themselves into a real dead-end cul-de-sac by demanding the opposite of everything Darwin said. Instead of seeing science as their friend, they saw it as an enemy, and they boxed themselves into a defensive stance that hasn't worked out so well for them. There's a British gentleman now deceased named Arthur Peacock, who is skilled in biology, but also very attentive to theology. And he wrote a book in which the main theme was that science is the disguised friend of theology, that in fact they do work together, but you don't see that when you only look at it superficially. So the skilled theologians that guided the Catholic Church for centuries, including all the recent centuries in which excellent scientific work has been done, are of a different flavor, a different category from those who cling to a literal interpretation of the Bible. And I spend a little bit of time in my chapter on evolution dealing with that problem. And a particularly Jewish scholar, I think, found the solution by which both points of view can be reconciled. But that the problem you bring up is, I think, an accurate one, in that Catholic theologians really didn't fall into the trap that some of our more conservative Protestant brothers have.
Couple, three things. And whenever I introduce something like that, I say to myself, I hope you can remember the third of the couple, three things. I would think that there's internal evidence in both Augustine and Aquinas that suggests that people well before, say, Luther, were trying to reconcile accounts of Scripture with what was already known about the natural world. I think that we can blame a great deal on Protestantism, but I don't think we can blame the whole problem on Protestantism. And whether we're Protestants or Catholics, if we're rooted in Scripture, we know that we are supposed to love God with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole mind. Our whole mind. And so I think that anything we can do to advance our own intelligence, the products, the fruits of our intelligence, contributes to our love of God, which calls for an intellectual dimension. Now, that said, I'd like to return, and we're already, this always happens, short on time, to time, because that's your real focus in Everywhen. It seems to me that you hold a non-deterministic view of the universe, and it seems to me as well that contemporary physics certainly is wide open to a non-deterministic view of the universe. In which case, there are certainly all sorts of future contingents, as we say in analytic philosophy. There are future contingents. Here's one. The Kansas City Chiefs will disgrace themselves in the upcoming Super Bowl.
They will win.
A future contingent. And I think that all of the fans, wherever they place their bets, would take that to be a future contingent. Now, if indeed there are true future contingents, then it would seem that although God knows all things past, present, and future, and although God knows everything that's to be known, whether in fact the Kansas City Chiefs will disgrace themselves is not knowable. That state of affairs doesn't exist. It may or may not exist. It's a matter of contingency. And so time comes into play here, but so also does whether or not there is any knowledge to be had. If there's any such thing as an existing future state of affairs. And maybe as someone who's keen on Everywhen, you could say something about the dismal performance of the Kansas City Chiefs next Sunday.
Well, the question of predestination has long bothered everybody. In the 17th century, Calvin and Luther got into a bitter argument about it that was never really concluded or settled. The Catholic Church avoided the problem by simply saying that we defer to God's greater wisdom and intelligence, that God can be capable of being present to all time. And it's almost impossible for any of us to get our head around it, because we humans are limited and only experience time in this sort of linear sequential way. So when we're talking about a transcendent being, God, who is outside and above and beyond time, our words fail us. We haven't got the mental images. We haven't got the thought structure that enables us to see time in a comprehensive way. But we must be deferential to God, who does see time in a unified way.
Now, with respect to omnipotence as opposed to omniscience, Thomas raises the question of whether God could create an immovable rock, immovable even by God. And Thomas said, well, you can put words together that way, but they don't refer to anything, don't you know? They don't refer to anything. And so when it comes to God's knowing future contingents, just depending on how we set up the particular case, it could be, seems to me, that the words don't refer to anything, don't you know? So it's not so much a matter of time as it is a matter of using language in such a way that it fails to refer.
Well, are you suggesting, Jim, that God doesn't know future contingents? Or that the question is posed wrong?
I have, let's put it this way, that God knows future contingents when in fact they don't exist is at least mildly offensive to my partly pious ears.
Well, you're on very solid ground there, because all of us tend to imagine and impose human limitations upon God, which is a mistake. And in Everywhen, one of the things I try to draw people's attention to is stop making the mistake of basing everything on a human perception of time when you're trying to talk about God, who is transcendent to time. And if you say, well, what does transcendent mean? I'll mumble and stagger around, but I don't really know.
But I'm puzzled by Jim.
I tell you about who is transcendent. And so we get ourselves into these human limitations and situations where we find ourselves unable to accurately describe the relationship between God and the universe, the human perception that we have is inadequate to grasp what God is all about. So I just say, observe that it's a limitation and then be deferential to God.
I guess what I'm suggesting, I think Tom is going to suggest that I am misunderstanding things very, very badly. But what I want to suggest is not so much that it's a limitation on human thought as it is a failure to look carefully at the nature of things. If somebody says, well, look here, God's all powerful, so it must be that he could build or create a rock that's immovable.
By the way, the modern version of that is, can God rust a muffler nut so tight that he himself can't loosen it?
Yes, that's a splendid example.
But
could God create a catalytic converter so perfectly placed that it couldn't be stolen? Something of that sort. I don't see it so much as a matter of transcendence. I don't see it so much as a matter of failure to understand God, as it seems to me simply a fact about human speech. There are some forms of speech that fail to refer. And that's just the way it is. Sometimes we use speech in a way that's grammatically correct, but it fails to refer to anything.
Well, certainly in the case of the immovable rock, you're correct. I agree, of course. But in the case of what we ordinarily would call future contingency, are you suggesting that there's a better way to phrase it, or that no matter how we designate it in words, that it doesn't refer to anything?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that ordinary statements about future contingents are such that they fail to refer to any future state of affairs, even though it might seem that they do, and that it's no skin off God's non-existent teeth if he doesn't know something that's not knowable simply because of the structure of the proposition that's presented. It doesn't get off the ground. But we're at the end of the show, except for Mario's last question. Mario, say something coherent, because I've been flirting with the incoherent.
What would be, in your view, the best way to educate people, young people, about the limit of science? That science, as is understood, hard sciences, is not the only answer to the human condition issues.
I think that it's not very difficult to state that, because in front of you every day are millions of examples in the interactions between human beings. The concepts like love, loyalty, devotion, all these things are so far beyond the realm of empirical science that all you can do is recognize that they do exist and they're part of reality, but they're not going to be proven or discussed or exemplified by any particular scientific theory. So even to a child, the relationship that goes on in a family between siblings, between parents and children and so forth, is so far beyond the measurement of physics, chemistry, or biology that it should be easy for even a young child to appreciate that God's relationship to all of us is far deeper than just science. So, yes, science is a partner with faith, but as they go down the pathway together towards God, while they share the goal and they share their destination, they do have different approaches that are complementary. But I would also say to young people, don't be afraid of science. People who flee from science because they're afraid of it are making a terrible mistake. To embrace science, recognize its value, is a very good thing to do. But don't put all your trust in science alone.
Thank you very much. We end now, as we always do, with the gospel for the day. And this comes from Mark. Jesus summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile." When he got home, away from the crowd, his disciples questioned him about the parable. He said to them, "Are even you likewise without understanding? Do you not realize that everything that goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and passes out into the latrine?" Thus he declared all foods clean. But what comes out of the man, that is what defiles him. From within the man, from his heart, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thomas and Mario.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Glad to be part of your
One of these
discussion.
days we'll get you back, because I want to talk about this congeries of consciousness that somehow or other could constitute immortal life. It seems to me you've neglected the substance and talked about the possibility of future life in a way that wouldn't involve human beings at all, because we're substantial beings. But you were just suggesting possible lines of inquiry.
Exactly true. What I really hope to do with that third section of the book was not to tell people believe what Tom Sheahen says, but to start thinking on your own in these new, original, and upward directions. So the examples that are in that part are definitely not a statement of truth or anything like that, but an indication of the kind of thinking people can start exploring.
I need to go. Thank you.
And fortunately, Sebastian has already left, so God love him. Thanks again to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.